This lecture is intended to get you up to speed on the topic of classicism, something that was such a critical component of the Renaissance. Essentially, the Renaissance is what we call a classical revivalist style. Classical revivalist. So what that means is that through specific features within Renaissance artwork, there is a looking back to earlier artworks from the ancient world, particularly to what we call the classical period. The art and architecture that you're going to learn about in this lecture will help you to not only understand how ancient art informed the Renaissance, but it's also going to help you to understand how ancient art informed other classical revivalist styles that we're going to be learning about later on in the semester, such as 18th century French and American neoclassicism. So obviously with this lecture, this is just the gift that keeps on giving. So the very first thing we're going to do here is we're going to break down some terms. You're going to see at the top of your screen, Greco-Roman classicism. Okay, so let's see what this is all about. So Greco, that refers to Greece, and Roman refers to Rome. So here's the situation. Greece had a very distinctive approach to art making, and we're going to learn about some of this approach in the lecture. Now, Rome was very much impressed by what the Greeks produced. They felt that it was sophisticated. They felt that it was indicative of high culture. The Romans, therefore, started to closely emulate both Greek art and architecture. Now, this created a lot of similarities in the style of Greek and Roman art. And because they're so similar, we art historians and other people sometimes lump the two together into what we call Greco-Roman. Okay, now classicism. So this term is both stylistic and chronological. Now, in terms of chronology, time, we're talking about the ancient world over the scope of roughly a millennium, more or less. We're talking about classical period Greece, so the 5th century, through to the late empire period of Rome, 4th century. Now, I'm saying 4th century Rome, not because this is when Rome fell, but because this is prior to the legalization of Christianity, which marks the end of the ancient world and the beginning of the medieval world. Now, stylistically, classicism refers to what was produced during this time period, 5th century BCE and onwards. Greek art does not begin with the classical period. It actually starts much earlier with the geometric period, but it's during the classical period that the classical approach was born. I think that makes sense. So let me show you what this classical approach involves. Now here we have two examples of Greek sculpture. One is from the Archaic period, which is an earlier period than the classical period, okay, which we can see the classical period example on the right. Now, an important thing to know about Greek sculpture is that its development was a progression. From the outset, from the geometric period, artists were moving towards creating more and more naturalistic depictions of the human form in sculpture. And we can see the gains they made really clearly, even just by comparing these two artworks. The Archaic period gives us images of people who are stiff and frontal. Frontal means that they face the front, which is very simple. The body is not shown in a complex way. And this is not considered to be necessarily naturalistic because our bodies are not simple. They move and they bend. And when we look at other people's bodies, we're looking at them from a variety of viewpoints. Very rarely would you ever encounter a body how we're actually seeing this Koros figure represented. Now, in contrast, we can see that the body of Doryphorus is positioned so that the hips angle slightly, allowing the torso to subtly shift. Along these lines, people don't stand stiff with arms, legs, and locked. The more formal, rigid pose we see with the Koros figure. In fact, we actually cannot stand like this because if you lock your arms and legs, that restricts blood flow, which could actually cause you to pass out. So that's really not a naturalistic pose to put a human form in. Now with Doryphorus, again, compare here or contrast, you're going to see it's more informal, it's more relaxed, and you've got a lot of that appearance of relaxation due to Polyclitus's choice to utilize the contrapposto stance, knee poking forward. Now let's take a look at another detail, the faces. You can see that the face of the Kouros has disproportionately large, almond-shaped eyes. This size and shape are not anatomically accurate. Now, why we're seeing this is actually explained by an Eastern influence on Greek sculpture during this time. Now, this Eastern influence goes away in the classical period, and you can see that as a result, looking at the face of Doryphorus, it looks a lot more realistic and the proportions are correct. Now, finally, let's take a look at the nudity. We see that both are naked, and that's pretty much a constant in Greek art, muscly naked men. But the proportions are now more accurate with Polyclitus's sculpture. Look at the Kouros. It has an overly thin waist, maybe even too thin to be anatomically possible. We also have on the Kouros figure what I call fat sausage ankles, where that lower part of the leg isn't clearly defined. Now, this wasn't because Greek sculptors didn't know how to sculpt ankles. The ankles needed to be thick like that to hold up the weight of the sculpture. In the classical period and beyond, the ankles become realistic, and what they do is they just add in an additional buttress to keep the sculpture from collapsing under its own weight. And you can see that added in the little buttress behind Doryphorus's leg. Now with the muscles, we can see that they are more defined in the classical period. In fact, these muscles are so emphasized, they're so explicit, that this body is like perfect, 0% body fat. And really this combination is what we call idealized, which refers to perfection. So let's summarize here to come up with a working definition of classicism. We see an interest in depicting the body realistically, but at the same time, the artists do this very delicate dance between realism and idealism. And this is a delicate dance because we know that in nature, and definitely in the human body, there really isn't such a thing as perfect. Here's another example, one to give you a sense of the treatment of the female form in terms of the classical approach. Like our Doryphorus example, we can see an increased sense of naturalism in the Nike sculpture. Rather than being stiff, frontal, and column-like, which is definitely the case with our Peplos Kore, we see instead a much more complex and I would say even interesting choices being made. I love this sculpture because it's very unexpected to see this goddess in this very awkward position, bending down, balancing her body as she adjusts her sandal. It's very human-like for a pose that you would see a goddess taking. But this is how we understand the body. The other feature to take notice of is the drapery. With the Kore figure, it just falls in one solid mass down her body. However, we understand clothing to wrinkle and bunch. It can hug the contours of the body, and all of that is happening with our Nike sculpture. It's a much more realistic treatment of cloth. Now, let me just show you one more example of sculpture before we move on. This is a Roman copy of a Greek classical sculpture by the Greek artist Myron. Now, think about what we've talked about so far. Pause the video and try to identify the classical features that have been presented to you so far in this lecture. So hopefully you did that. We can see the realistic treatment of the body in terms of proportion. We can see the musculature that looks realistic, yet it's idealistic at the same time. Super perfect. And I do also want to point out too, one thing that also characterizes the classical style, and I haven't brought it up because I'm just noticing it looking at this beautiful male body here, is the attention to detail. If you look really close, for example, look at the gluteus maximus. Look at how defined that is. What an interesting detail to kind of show where that muscle meets with either bone or muscle. I'm not an anatomy expert in the leg here. Or my favorite part of the whole sculpture, if you look down at the bottom at the feet, as he's twisted and lifts his leg up, he curls the toes under. And that really emphasizes that pivoting motion. This is such a good sculpture. Oh my gosh, I could just keep looking and looking. Like, look at the veins and how they're articulated in the wrist that holds the disc. It's like you can see the blood coursing through his body as he's getting ready to throw this disc. Oh my gosh, it's really so good. The other thing, I do also want to point out too is, again, that interest in showing the body in naturalistic proportions, and also in these different kind of postures that aren't just like boring old frontal. This one's super cool because he's in this mid-athletic maneuver. And actually, this is one of the earliest Greek sculptures to show, or attempting to show, this sense of movement, this motion captured in this like split second. Now, this image, as I'm sure you're well aware, is an athlete, just like Doryphorus, our spear bearer. So you've got this idea of a victorious, strong, youthful athlete, and this is a common subject in Greek sculpture. Now, we get the youth, or we can identify the person's youth because there's no beard, which is a very common iconographic symbol of age. And we can also get the sense of youth because the body doesn't show signs of getting old. We're not seeing wrinkling or sagging or anything like that. We get the sense of victory and strength because you've obviously got this muscly body that is clearly operating at like peak physical perfection. Now, the reason why we see this common subject in Greek sculpture is because it fit the cultural definition of a masculine hero. And this was an ideal, the hero, that began to take root in Greece around the 7th century. What was happening was, first of all, there were poets who roamed around spreading exciting stories and epic poems, many of which celebrated the adventures of brave individuals that resulted in power and glory. Maybe you've heard of the most famous of these poets, this guy named Homer, who wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey. Such glory through physical feats and bravado, as celebrated in these epic narratives, was something that was already on the Greeks' radar. There may be something else you've heard of before, the Olympics. The Olympics, which was a series of sporting events, they began in Olympia in the 8th century, 775 BCE, and then later they were adopted elsewhere throughout the Greek city-states in the 6th century. Finally, in the 6th century, there was widespread political dissatisfaction, and people began to demand freedom from their oppression by a powerful and wealthy elite. It was this call for revolution that required action. Now, there's a reason why I'm telling you this, just not like, hey, here's some random extra information. With these examples of why the hero came to be in Greece, what you can see is that there's this emphasis placed on being an individual. This ideal of individualism is something that also features prominently into the mindset of humanism, which was the ideological foundation of the Renaissance. So with classicism, it's not just only the artistic characteristics that inspire the Renaissance. It's also ideological characteristics as well. So it's kind of my hope, it is my hope that with this lecture, when you see something like Michelangelo's David, you can now understand where this is coming from. The David just doesn't like disappear or appear out of nowhere, out of the creative brilliance that is Michelangelo. You can see that a lot of it is coming from earlier classical Greek sculpture. Now, let's talk about architecture. So we can see on the left a Roman triumphal arch. This was an architectural form that was distinctly Roman. So this was not something that the Romans copied from Greece. The triumphal arch was very popular. We start to see them constructed as early as the 2nd century BCE, and they are built all the way through to the end of the empire. They were markers of commemoration. They could celebrate events as grand as military victories or something as mundane as building a road. They were consistent in their form, rectangular in shape, with an archway in the middle, although later arches began to feature multiple archways. And if we look at our Masaccio painting from the early Italian Renaissance, which is on the right, you can see that this painting is replicating, in some ways, the Roman triumphal arch. Now, first, Masaccio, who just here's a little fun fact, his name means Big Tom. He arranges his figures within a space that looks very similar to the triumphal arch in the sense that it's got that rectangular shape. It's got the archway as well. Now, we can be even more specific here. If you look at both examples, you can see that there's columns on either side of the entryway. So columns, this is something that we totally can associate with classical architecture. Very, very common. Now, both columns feature at their top a decoration, a little curly decoration that we call a volute. You can see the tiny red circles that I put in here to point them out for you. Probably if you get up close to Big Tom's painting there, you can see what these look like. The volute was a common feature, again, appearing at the top of the column, which is called the capital, very common in Greek Ionic architecture. You've got geometric shape, rectangle, and that's something else that we can also connect to Greco-Roman architecture, which placed much emphasis on geometric form as a reflection of perfection, order, and rationality. Now, in the painting by Masaccio, on either side of the columns are these, like, you can see them, they're like taller, square-shaped columns with lines in them. The lines are called fluting, and the square columns are called pilasters, tomato, however you want to say it. These are both from Greco-Roman architecture as well. Well, actually, fluting, that originated in Egyptian architecture, but we find it more commonly in Greece and then in Rome. Finally, in Masaccio's painting, look inside the archway. You can see a square pattern. And then look inside the archway of the Arch of Titus, you can see a square pattern. That square pattern is called coffering. Each square is a coffer. And you guessed it, the coffers have their origins in the classical period. Now let's go back to our title slide that we looked at the beginning of this lecture. Now you might be able to understand the classical features in this painting a little bit better. You actually can see a triumphal arch, two triumphal arches in the background. So now that's totally taken straight from Roman architecture. And then the middle building is like a textbook example of a dome structure executed in the classical style. Here's an example. Pantheon, the most important structure ever built. So if you notice here, both of these are rotundas. That means a round building. And they both have domes. Okay, this is classical features of architecture. The rotunda with the dome, that actually was an idea first developed by the Greeks and one that Rome brought over later on. But Greco-Roman rotundas, very common. You can look, you can recognize the columns. Okay, so that's typical. And then above the columns, you see a triangle-shaped roof. And you can see it, the triangle-shaped roof in both. That triangle-shaped roof is called a pediment. Now, in addition to the architectural elements that are classical, let's look at the overall aesthetic on both these structures. You can see that both structures, if you put like a dividing line down the middle, they're perfect symmetry. You also see that there is this preponderance of geometric shapes, again referencing order, perfection, rationality. Both of these. Symmetry also is order, perfection, rationality. Balance also relates to these ideas. And I'm saying this because it doesn't hurt to note that these ideals, order, perfection, rationality, very nicely complement humanism and its focus on education. So I just have one more example here to kind of like test ourselves to see if we can evaluate what classical features are found in this early Renaissance painting here. Now let's both make a list, okay? So pause the video, list the classical features that you can see, come back, and we'll compare our lists. So hopefully you did that, okay? So here's what I found. If you look in the background, we have arches. You see the rounded supports, the arches. You can see that there are pilasters, square columns. You can see the square columns. Symmetry. So divide the composition right down the middle. And you can see that there is an equal distribution of visual weight on each side. Same shapes, same colors, more or less. That creates balance. And in some areas, you can draw the dividing line and you've got like perfect symmetry as well. So hopefully you found this video to be helpful as you move forward, understanding not only Renaissance art that we're studying right now, but also the neoclassical art that we're going to study in the future.